Week 13 of fantasy football season. Here's a few tight ends. I have his sleepers this week. The first tight end, Brenton Strange of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Strange, surprisingly, still out there in 76% of fantasy leagues, and that's still a sleeper option to me. Strange came off IR last week for this Jacksonville Jaguar team, and he had a good ball game at Arizona. 5 catches, 93 yards. So this week, a good matchup at the Tennessee Titans. Long having trouble stopping opposing teams. So this week, Brenton Strange, like I said, he had a good week last week back in the lineup. Targets are going to be there, and even going back early in the season, I've said this in other videos as well with Strange, that he was the most consistent target in this passing game. Brian Thomas, it's been a bad season for him in his second season in the league. I know Jacoby Myers, he wasn't on the team yet early in the season, but like I said, Strange came back last week, had a good game, and he's out there as a good sleeper option out there in 76% of fantasy leagues. Next tight end, Pat Freiermuth of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Pat Freiermuth, he's been a touchdown-dependent tight end all season long out there in 86% of fantasy leagues. And it looks like Aaron Rodgers will return to the lineup, only missing one game with the wrist fracture for Aaron Rodgers. So week 10 for Freiermuth at the Chargers, 3 catches, 33 yards. Week 11 versus the Bengals, a catch, 19 yards. And week 12 at the Bears, 3 catches, 19 yards, and found the end zone in that one. So this week, Buffalo's defense hasn't been good overall. But versus tight ends, they actually do give up the least amount of fantasy points. But like I said, with Rodgers back in the lineup, him and Freiermuth, they were building some rapport and getting things going. But the only thing with Freiermuth, like I said, he's been a touchdown-dependent tight end all season long, but still someone a sleeper this week. In the final tight end, Mike Gesicki of the Cincinnati Bengals. Gesicki came off the pec injury last week, and he had a mediocre game. But obviously passing Noah Fant on the depth chart. 4 catches, 35 yards on 6 targets versus the Patriots in last week's game. So this week, a matchup at Baltimore. I know their defense has been good as well versus the tight end position, giving up the 6th least amount of fantasy points to tight ends on the season. But with T. Higgins out, targets have to get spread out a little bit throughout this offense. I think Andre Yoshivas, obviously, will get some targets, possibly Mitch Tinsley, but Gesicki's a big target, especially in the red zone with his height and size. So last week, coming off of 6 targets, and with Burrow back in the lineup, in possibly a high-scoring game. I have this week Gesicki, a sleeper option, and he's available right now. 98% of fantasy leagues. That's a few tight ends I have as sleepers for week 13 of the fantasy football season.